Hello everyone and welcome to The Good Old Gamer. So in the previous video, we took a look at the i5 2500K and saw how well it performed in modern games. Short version, not so well. It did alright, but it just didn't quite get that 60 FPS gaming experience that most PC gamers are looking for. So here today, we're going to be taking a look at the Core i3 10100 non-F, doesn't really matter because we're going to be using a discrete graphics card. We're going to be taking a look to see if the Skylake architecture with 4 cores and 8 threads will deliver the performance that we're looking for in today's games. Now, before we get into it, if you like videos like this, please smash that like button, please subscribe, please share with friends. You can also help directly support the channel by becoming a member over here on YouTube by clicking the little join button down below, or jumping over on Patreon. You get Discord access, you can ask Paul and I questions every week on the Techonomics podcast, and get access to the After Hours podcast. Also, I want to go ahead and explain why I'm doing these tests. These are kind of academic. These are for people out there that may still have these CPUs and they want to see if they're still good running modern games, or if you have a CPU that's superior to these, I want to demonstrate that you may not need a CPU upgrade. Since GPUs have become very difficult to get your hands on at reasonable prices, a lot of people out there are now going ahead and spending exorbitant amounts of money on CPUs because you can actually get those. In reality, if gaming is the primary feature that you want, you don't need a whole heck of a lot. And that's what I want to prove with this series. That's why I'm testing all of these CPUs, the i3 10100 here today, with an RX 6700 XT. This is an overpowered GPU for this CPU, or is it? See, that's the thing. The overhead on the AMD graphics cards are lower, and you can typically get away with a weaker CPU and gain the same performance as you would with a higher-end CPU with a similar NVIDIA graphics card. So there's many facets to the reason why I'm doing these videos, mostly to show you guys that you can get away with less than what you may think that you need. A lot of the influencers out there in the tech community tell you you need X, Y, or Z, and in reality, you can get away with substantially less. Now, one last little tidbit before we get into the test specs and the benchmarks. I do want to address the reason why we're using such an unbalanced pairing is to eliminate the GPU overhead or GPU bottleneck as much as possible. A lot of comments on my last video were asking, why aren't you running 1440p or 4K with that graphics card? Because if you can get 60 FPS at 1080p, you can then get 60 FPS at 4K as long as the GPU is powerful enough to do that. So this is the reason why on CPU testing, you use a lower resolution. In this case, I'm testing at 1080p. There seems to be this weird misconception that if you raise the resolution, the CPU overhead goes down. This actually is not the case if you're trying to hit a target frame rate. In this case, most of the games that we're looking at are 60 FPS, Doom, Eternal. That's one that you obviously want 120 FPS plus. So for example, if a CPU at 1080p with an OP GPU is not able to sustain 60 FPS at 1080p, the frame rate will not go up when you raise the resolution. Basically, you're seeing the ceiling that the CPU is able to produce. So regardless of resolution, this is the best frame rate you could possibly get out of this CPU. And in reality, people upgrade their graphics cards far more often than their CPUs. So if you have a processor that's still capable of getting you 60 or 120 in the titles that you want, there's no need to touch that. You're fine. You're still good to go. You just need a graphics card upgrade to get the resolutions that you want. Okay, so now that I've explained how CPU testing works and that's out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the parts. So the star of the show is the Intel Core i3 10100. I picked this up last November, I believe, during the holiday season for $99. This is a 2020 $100-ish CPU. The 10100F, I think MSRP was like $105. Nowadays, they are a little bit more because entry-level CPUs are being gobbled up by miners, but at the same time, if you got one of these or something that's similar to this, like an i7 6700 non-K, this is kind of the performance level you should be expecting. And as mentioned, we're pairing this with the MSI Mech 2 RX 6700 XT 12GB. This is definitely a 1440p or 4K capable graphics card, essentially on par with something like a 2080 Ti from last generation. And this should afford us enough GPU overhead at 1080p that we can see what the CPU is truly capable of. Now, another added benefit to going with a budget CPU is you can get budget motherboards. In this case, I'm using a Gigabyte H410 S2H. Sorry, it's kind of a weird name for a motherboard. This is a micro ATX board. I got this for like $80. They're very, very cheap. It was the least expensive H410 board that I could get my hands on. And honestly, it works just fine with this particular pairing. For the CPU cooler, once again, I'm using the Vetru V5 120mm RGB powdered black tower cooler. This thing was really great with the i5 2500K. Just slapped it on the i3 10100, and yeah, temperature is great. This is an absolutely fantastic cooler at a very reasonable price point. For the RAM, Kingston was kind enough to send us over a kit of 32 gigabytes DDR4 3200 CL16s. And I'm going ahead and using this here. Now, obviously, this is a locked CPU and you can't overclock the RAM, so it's only running at 2666 in this video. But this is a really great kit of RAM that they sent over. Kingston was also kind enough to send over a KC 2500 1TB PCIe Gen 3 NVMe for testing on our test benches. And obviously, that's going to probably be the type of storage that most of you guys are going to be going with here today. 2 terabytes are still a little pricey, but not too bad. And then anything beyond that's kind of crazy. Now, for the rest of the test bench, you can go ahead and check the links down below, all the specs, all the stuff. If you want to check them out, links, affiliate links are down there. That also helps support the channel if you guys are interested in picking any of this stuff up. So, all right, guys, with the test bench out of the way, the testing methodology out of the way, let's go ahead and see how the i3 10100 fares when paired with something like an RX 6700 XT. All right, so kicking things off, we're starting with Metro Exodus, and as you guys can see here, we're coming in 120-ish, 115 FPS. That's pretty solid. When things kick off, it does dip a little bit below 100 FPS, but not a whole lot. This is obviously playable even at high refresh rates on this particular CPU. And then overall, the average frame rate comes out at 121 FPS with a 1% low of 94. So overall, a great experience on Metro Exodus. All right, kicking things over to Cyberpunk 2077. This was a game that was very difficult to run on the i5 2500K. I'm hoping the i3 10100 will do better. We're sitting somewhere in the mid 80s. This isn't too bad, pulling out of the garage, coming onto the street. And things actually are holding up pretty well. We saw the frame rate dip into the mid 50s with the 2500K at this point. Now we're sitting in the mid 70s, so that's significantly better. Overall, the benchmark shows an average frame rate of 75 FPS with a 1% low of 54 FPS. So this game is definitely playable at that 60 FPS target that most people are looking for. And with a FreeSync or VRR display, it's going to deliver a perfectly smooth gaming experience. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is one of the more demanding games on the CPU, especially in this village sequence that we're doing. This absolutely crushed the 2500K, but here we're starting off over 100 FPS, and then as we're approaching the village, we're sitting in the mid 80s. You can see that frame rate, it's just dropping the more NPCs there are on scene, but even once we get in on this little, I guess you could call it like a little bar or a cafe, even then it was still over 70 FPS. And with Shadow of the Tomb Raider coming in with an average frame rate of 95 FPS and a 1% low of 58, this game is definitely playable if you go ahead and lock to 60 or even 75 FPS, giving you a great smooth experience. And so this is an excellent, excellent uplift over the stuttery mess that we saw with the i5 2500K. All right, so next up is Doom Eternal, and to nobody's surprise, this thing runs like an absolute champion. The game had no problems even on the i5 2500K for high refresh gaming. With the i3 10100, you could pretty much push the 240 hertz monitors without too much of an issue. So this could step you up if you are into the crazy high FPS range. But realistically, this game is just going to run at just about anything. I just wanted to show you guys how high the FPS can get with a $100-ish CPU. So next up is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and this is another huge win for the i3 10100 over the i5 2500K. Even though both CPUs are quad cores, this one with its architectural changes and hyper-threading is able to massively outperform the 2500K with an average of 109 FPS and a 1% low of 63 FPS. So this game right here would run perfectly if you just cap the frame rate to 60 FPS. It will run 100% smooth, or go ahead with like a 75 FPS target and your 1% lows and your average would still be within a pretty good range. Next up is Watch Dogs Legion. This is another game that really struggled with the i5 2500K, and we can see that the frame rate's between the mid-60s. It's starting to bump up into the 70s. Overall, this is delivering a much better experience than the old Core i5, as we're well over the 60 FPS, with the average frame rate coming in at 70 and a 1% low of 53 FPS. This game would be perfectly playable, capped at 60 FPS, delivering a great experience. And last up is Horizon Zero Dawn, and like I mentioned in the last video, this does not like to play well with the 6700 XT drivers, so it runs for about a minute and then just decides to crash. Since we got through an entire run on the i5 2500K and that run ran at a locked 60 FPS, it's safe to assume that any CPU faster than that is going to have no trouble at all running this game. So yeah, we can't actually test how fast it goes, but we know that 60 FPS plus is not going to be a problem. Well, alrighty guys, there we go. So this is a much better showing. Now, to nobody's surprise, a Skylake level CPU with 4-core 8 threads is obviously going to outperform a 10-year-old Core i5 2500K. However, the uplift is substantially higher than anything that I was expecting, and I'm betting you guys are probably in the same boat. So games that might get like 40, 45 FPS on the i5 2500K, we're now getting like 70 or 80 or even up to 100 FPS on average, which is absolutely insane. Now, what's really interesting is I can definitively say, yes, the $100-ish Core i3 10100 from 2020 is capable of running all modern games at playable frame rates when properly paired with a decent GPU. At least an AMD GPU in this case, because we don't have that driver overhead. In the future, I will be testing that. I will get an NVIDIA card on hand, and we will see how much of an effect that has. But this is something a lot of you guys may not have realized. Many of you might be like, well, you need at least a 6-core. Not if you have an AMD GPU, not with all the titles, the most demanding titles that are out here today. If you're looking at something like Battlefield, which has a ton of players on screen, yes, you might need something a little bit more. But if you're more like me and you prefer single-player games, nope, $100 or sub-$100 CPUs are really all you need to get very good, perfectly playable gaming experiences here today in 2021. In my opinion, this is good news. In a world where graphics card prices are just going to the moon, this lets you guys know if you have a CPU that's at least at the level of the i3 10100, you can just leave that alone and keep it, or if you're doing a fresh build, you might be able to get away with just a cheap 4-core, 8-thread CPU, get the GPU that you want, spend a little bit more, so save on the CPU, spend a little bit more on the graphics card, and you're still going to get the great performance that you're looking for. Now, the key takeaway here is you cannot do this with an NVIDIA graphics card. Steve from Hardware Unboxed proved this. I will do a video showing the exact same thing. You will not get this level of performance with an NVIDIA graphics card. So NVIDIA typically costs more to begin with, and then you need a more expensive CPU to pair with that. This is something not a lot of people talk about. That's one of the main reasons why I want to do these videos, because if you want to save money, AMD graphics cards, that's a big feature for them. You can get away with a weaker CPU like the i3 10100. Well, alrighty guys, in the next video, we're going to take a look at the Ryzen 5 1600. I know many of you guys have one or are still using one regularly. That's probably the real replacement for something like the 2500K that most people got. It was very cheap. You got 6 cores, 12 threads. It's a more modern-ish CPU. Windows 11 may or may not support it, but whatever. At the same time, this is something that a lot of you guys have and will probably want to know if it can still play these games at playable frame rates. So that's coming in the next video. And as I mentioned, in the future, we will be testing NVIDIA versus Radeon head-to-head. Here in the future, I have somebody sending me an RTX 2080 Ti, which is roughly on par with something like the RX 6700 XT. The main reason why I wanted the 2080 Ti, they have similar amounts of RAM versus something like an RTX 3070, which could come into play here. Regardless, we're going to go ahed and use this i3 10100 to see how big of an impact that has, because the Radeon graphics card, all the games run. They run very well here, but we're going to see just how poorly the NVIDIA driver overhead hampers that. So if you like videos like that, if you're interested in that type of content, please go ahead and click that subscribe button and that little notification bell down below. That really helps out the channel. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on testing like this. Do you find this beneficial? Do you think that this is helping the community find alternate solutions when, everything else is going crazy? Once again, love hearing your feedback on that stuff. And that's really all I have for you guys here today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.